In the autumn of 1887, in a fold of the Bitterroot Valley in Montana Territory, a woman of 28 stood in front of a building everyone in the town of Holden's Crossing had agreed was worthless, and she counted out the last money she had in the world to own it. The building was a grist mill, or what a fire 2 winters before had left of one. The roof had fallen in along the north slope. The siding above the waterline was charred to black scale, the kind of char that flakes off in your hand like burnt paper. The great wheel still hung on its iron axle, but the buckets were gone to ash, and the rim was warped where the heat had taken it. Men who passed it on the river road called it the burnt mill and did not slow down. The woman who bought it was named Cora Vane, and she had nothing behind her but a dead man's tools and the thing he had taught her hands to do. She paid $40. The clerk at the land office counted the coins twice, because he did not believe a woman would spend her last $40 on a ruin, and then he believed it because the coins were real and there were no more behind them. What she did not yet know, standing there with the deed folded into her satchel, was that the floor of that ruined mill held something the man who burned it had been certain no one would ever trouble to lift. Stay with me through the work of it, because the work is the whole of the story, and the thing under the floor did not give itself up easily. Cora Vane had come into the valley 3 weeks earlier on the back of a freight wagon, having walked out of a marriage that the law still said she belonged to, and the church still said she could not leave. Her husband had been a man named Elias Birch, who drank, and who had a way of explaining, afterward, why the bruise was her own doing. She had taken the tool chest that had been her grandfather's, because it was hers by his will and by his hand on her shoulder when she was a girl, and she had left everything else. The tool chest was oak, banded in iron, and it weighed near 100 pounds. She had paid a teamster $2 to haul it the last 40 miles, and she had guarded it the whole way like it held gold, because in the only sense that mattered to her, it did. Her grandfather had been Asa Vane, a millwright. In the years before the railroads reached that country, he had built and rebuilt half the grist mills and sawmills along 3 rivers, and he had taken his granddaughter with him from the time she could carry a chisel without cutting herself. He had taught her the way a man teaches when he knows he is the last of something and means to pour it into the only vessel he trusts. He taught her the framing of a mill, the housing of the gears, the cutting of the wooden cogs that drove the stones, the fitting of a floor so tight that grain dust could not work down between the boards. He taught her to read a building, the way other people read a face. There is a thing he said to her more than once, when she grew impatient with the slowness of good work. He said, "The wood remembers everyone who ever touched it, and if you go slow enough it will tell you what they did." She had been a girl and had thought it only a way of telling her to mind her joints. She understood it differently now. Asa Vane had died the winter Cora turned 19, and the tools had gone into a corner of her father's barn, and then into the house Elias Birch kept, where they had sat unused for 9 years, because a wife in that house did not build things. The first free breath Cora took, she took with her hand on the lid of that chest. She did not have a plan beyond the chest and the skill in her hands. She had a notion that a country full of mills must have need of someone who could fix them, and she had heard in a town 2 valleys over that there was a burnt mill at Holden's Crossing that the bank wanted gone. The bank was the Cattlemen's and Merchants' Trust, and the man who ran it was named Royal Tasker. He was a polite man, soft in the voice, careful in his dress, the sort of man who never raised his hand because he had ledgers to do his raising. For him he held paper on 1/3 of the valley. When Cora came to ask about the burnt mill, he received her in an office that smelled of cigar smoke and beeswax, and he looked at her the way a man looks at a thing that has wandered into the wrong room. The mill was no good to anyone, he told her. The fire had ruined it. The previous owner, a miller named Tobias Hett, had died in debt, and the property had reverted, and the bank would sell the land for $40 only to be free of the taxes on it. He said the word 40 as though it should embarrass her. He did not tell her how Tobias' head had died. She would learn that later, and it would matter. She paid the $40. Tasker signed the deed with a fine steel pen and pushed it across the desk, and as she folded it away he said one more thing in his soft and reasonable voice. He said, "You understand there is nothing in it." She said she understood. It was the only lie she told in the whole affair because she did not understand anything yet, but she had learned long ago not to argue with a man who held the paper. The town heard about it before she had hauled her chest from the freight office to the mill, because in a place like Halden's crossing news traveled faster than wagons. By the time she reached the river road, there were already men who had arranged to be standing where she would pass, so they could see the woman who had bought the burnt mill. One of them, a freighter named Del Quint, called out that she had paid $40 for a bonfire that had already burned. The others laughed. "A woman cannot run a mill," another said, not troubling to lower his voice, "and a burnt one she cannot even start." Cora did not answer them. She had her grandfather's chest on a borrowed handcart, and her whole attention was on keeping it from tipping in the ruts, and she had decided before she ever reached the valley that she would let the work answer for her, because she had no other voice that men like these would hear. The auctioneer of the town, a round man named Phelps, who had handled the bank sale, made the joke that went around longest. He said she had bought herself a fine view of the river and a great deal of charcoal, and that if she meant to make a living, she might sell the charcoal back to the men who had lost their hens to it. People repeated that one for a week. Cora heard it twice and said nothing either time. The mill stood where Halden Creek ran into the larger river, on a stone foundation that the fire had not touched, because stone does not burn. That foundation was the first thing Cora examined, on her hands and knees in the cold morning, and the first thing that told her the men were wrong about what she had bought. The foundation was sound. The fire had gutted the upper works and the roof and the wheel, but the stone sill and the heavy floor frame beneath the milling floor had been protected by the very thing that had been stored on that floor, which was sacks of grain and flour that had smothered as much as they had fed the fire. A grain fire is a strange thing. It burns hot and fast at the top and chokes itself at the bottom. The floor of that mill had been scorched, but not consumed. Cora knew floors. She had laid them with her grandfather, and she had repaired them, and she knew that the milling floor of a working grist mill is built heavier than any floor in a house, because it carries the weight of the stones and the jar of the gears and the constant tread of men with sacks on their backs. It is built of planks 2 inches thick or more, laid close, often doubled, and pinned down with cut nails or with wooden pegs into joists set near enough together that a man could not put his boot between them. A floor like that is a thing of great patience to build and great patience to take up. She did not yet know she would take it up. She only knew, that first morning, that the bones of the place were better than its owner had said. She set her chest inside the one corner where the roof still held, and she made a camp there, and she began. For the first week, she did the work anyone would have expected, the work that made the men who passed nod and tell each other she would last till the first hard snow and no longer. She cleared the fallen roofing. She knocked down the burnt siding that hung by a nail and threw it in a heap to be carted off. She found the wheel was past saving and let it be. She found the millstones, the great paired discs that did the grinding, cracked through by the heat, and that was a loss she felt in her stomach, because good stones cost more than she would ever have. A mill with cracked stones grinds nothing. If she had bought the place to mill grain, she had bought a failure. She had not bought it to mill grain, though she did not fully know that yet either. She had bought it because it was the only thing she could afford that was hers, and because her hands needed work, and because a part of her that she did not examine too closely wanted to take a thing the world had thrown away and make it answer for itself. She kept on past the point where milling was possible, into the part of the work where she was simply a woman taking a building apart to understand it, and that was where the wood began to talk. It was the floor that spoke first. She had been sweeping the milling floor clear of ash and the char of fallen timbers, working her broom and then her bare hands across the heavy planks, when she felt it. One section of the floor, perhaps 8 feet square, off in the northeast corner away from where the stones had stood, did not ring the same under her knuckles. She had spent a childhood learning the sounds a building makes. A floor laid solid over close joists gives back a dull, dead, satisfied sound when you rap it. This corner gave back something hollower, not the ring of rot, and the fire had not reached there with any strength, and her awl, pressed into the plank, met sound wood. It was a hollowness underneath, a void where the joists and the packed earth should have been close beneath the boards. She knelt over that corner a long time. A lesser builder would have thought nothing of it, or would have thought the fire had done something strange below. Cora had laid mill floors, though, and she knew that no millwright worth his wage leaves a void under the heaviest used floor in the building. You do not build a hollow under the place. Men walk with 200 pounds of grain on their backs. The weight alone would work the planks loose inside a year and crack the joists inside too. A void there served no purpose any honest builder would own. It was wrong. It was wrong in the way a thing is wrong when someone has made it wrong on purpose and then laid a good floor over the wrongness to hide it. What she did, then she did the way her grandfather had taught her, which is to say slowly and with the right tool and with respect for the wood, even though she meant to lift it. She did not take a wrecking bar to it. A wrecking bar would have splintered the planks and told her nothing. She wanted the boards up, whole, because whole boards keep their evidence. She found the line where the close-laid planks met the suspect section, and she read the surface for the nail heads, and she saw at once a second thing that quickened her. The nails in that 8-foot section were not the same as the nails everywhere else. Everywhere else in the floor the nails were old cut nails, square-shanked, the heads worn down by years of boots, set when the mill was first built. In the suspect corner, the nail heads were newer, less worn. Set by her eye, some years after the rest of the floor, and set by a hand that knew how to match old work closely enough to fool a careless glance, but not closely enough to fool a millwright's granddaughter on her knees with the morning light raking across the grain. Someone had taken up this corner of the floor, done something beneath it, and laid the floor back down, and they had done it well enough that no one had noticed for years. And then, perhaps they had set a fire that they expected to erase the whole question. Here is the part of the story where I ask you to consider how many things in this world are buried under good carpentry, how many wrongs are laid over with a tight floor and a fresh coat of whitewash and left for the years to forget. Think on that, and then come back to the woman on her knees. Because she was about to lift the board, she worked the first plank for the better part of a day. She used a thin pry her grandfather had forged, ground to an edge that would slip between boards without crushing the fibers, and a wooden mallet, because a steel hammer on the pry would have run through the valley, and she found, without quite deciding to, that she did not want an audience for this. She set the pry, tapped, moved it along, tapped again, walking the plank up a fraction at a time so the cut nails drew straight and did not snap. It is the slowest way to lift a floor. It is the only way to lift one hole. Twice the pry slipped and barked her knuckles against the next board, and she stopped and wrapped the worst of it in a strip of rag, and went on, because her grandfather had taught her that a builder who lets a hurt hand rush the work ruins the work and the hand both. The board complained the whole way, a long, dry groaning of old nails giving up their grip, and she answered it with patience, the way you answer a horse that does not want to be shod. By evening, she had the first board up, 11 feet of 2-inch fir, dark with age on top and pale and clean on the underside, the wood still bright where it had not seen light in 30 years, and she carried it to the wall and leaned it there like something she meant to give back. Under the first board was not earth. Under the first board was a second floor. She had half expected it, and it stopped her breath all the same. Below the milling floor, where there should have been joists bedded in packed earth and stone, there was a second layer of planking, laid the other way, and below that a space. A built space. Someone had framed a low chamber under the corner of the mill, floored it, and floored over it again, and the upper floor was the one the whole town had walked on without knowing. The cold air that came up out of the gap between the boards was the still, dead, mineral-smelling air of a place that had been closed a long time. Her grandfather had a phrase for the smell of a space long sealed. He called it the breath the building had been holding. She had never understood the phrase until that evening, with the cold breath of years rising into her face. She did not go down that night. She was not a fool, and a woman alone does not lower herself into a dark hole in a ruined building at dusk. She laid a board over the opening, and she sat with her back against her grandfather's chest, and she ate cold bread, and she watched the gap the way you watch a thing that has changed the shape of your future, and she waited for the light. In the morning, 2 men came down the river road and stopped the way men had been stopping for 2 weeks. One was Del Quint, the freighter. The other was a man she had not seen before, older, with a white beard gone yellow at the mouth from tobacco, and a way of standing as though his back hurt him, which it did. Quint made some remark about whether she had found her fortune in the ashes, yet the old man did not laugh. The old man looked past her at the heap of burnt siding she had cleared, and the patch of floor she had opened, and something moved across his face that was not amusement. He told Quint to go on. Quint went, after a moment, the way a man goes when an older man he respects has told him to, and the old man stayed. His name was Ned Forsyth. He had lived in the valley since before the town had a name, and he had known the mill when it ran, and he had known the miller Tobias Het. He stood at the edge of Cora's open floor and looked down at the cold, dark gap of it for a long while, and then he said a thing that changed the work from a woman's curiosity into something with a weight of years behind it. He said, Tobias always swore that floor was wrong. He said it the year before he died. Nobody listened to him because by then nobody listened to Tobias about anything. Cora asked him to sit, and she gave him the better part of her bread, and she listened, because the wood had begun to tell her what had happened, and now a man who remembered was going to tell her the rest, and the two would have to be laid against each other like a tenon into its mortise to see if they fit. Ned Forsyth told it slowly, because he was old, and because it was not a happy thing to tell. The mill had been built 30 years before by a company of settlers who had pooled their money, and Tobias Het had run it for all of them. And for a long while it was the heart of the valley, because a mill is where everyone's grain comes, and so it is where everyone meets and where everyone's accounts are kept. Tobias kept the accounts in a ledger: who had brought how much grain, who was owed flour, who had paid, and who had not. And in the lean years, when the railroad had not yet come and money was scarce, the valley had done a thing that valleys did in those days. They had used the mill as a bank. Men who had a good harvest left their surplus in coin and in gold dust with Tobias for safekeeping, because Tobias was honest and the mill had a stout iron box, and there was no other bank within 60 miles. Then the real bank came. The Cattlemen's and Merchants' Trust and Royal Tasker. And Tasker, Ned said, wanted the deposits that were sitting in Tobias Het's iron box. He wanted them in his vault, drawing into his hands the way a banker wants all the water in the valley running through his own ditch. He made offers. Tobias refused, because the money was not his to give to another man. It had been left with him by neighbors on a handshake. And then, Ned said, the trouble started. Notes Tobias did not remember signing began to come due. The bank held paper that said the mill owed it money, a great deal of money, more than the mill had ever borrowed. Tobias swore the notes were forged. He was an old man by then and not believed, and the bank was new and polished and very much believed, and the law in that country was whatever the man with the most paper said it was. Cora listened and laid it against the floor. A forged note is a piece of paper. It is the easiest thing in the world to make and the hardest thing in the world to disprove, unless somewhere there is the true record, the real ledger, the genuine accounts that show what was truly owed and truly held, against which the forgeries could be measured and shown false. And a man who feared his neighbor's money would be stolen by a polished banker, a man who built mills and knew floors, a man whose own miller's hands had laid that heavy floor. Such a man might take up a corner of it and build a chamber, and put the true record and the true deposits down where no banker's writ could reach, and lay the floor back over it, and tell no one but perhaps swear in his last bad year that the floor was wrong, so that someone someday might think to look. And then the mill burned. Ned Forsythe came to that part last and quietest. The fire had come in the night, 2 winters past, and Tobias Het had died in it. The town had called it an accident, an old man and a lamp and a building full of grain dust, which will explode if you so much as look at it wrong. Ned had never believed it, though, because Tobias by then slept in the town, not the mill, and had no reason to be in the mill at night, and because the fire had started by the look of the char on the milling floor and not near the lamp oil or the office. Ned had said as much once to a deputy, and the deputy had written nothing down, because the deputy banked at the Cattlemen's and Merchants' Trust, like everyone else, and a man does not write down a thing that troubles the man who holds his note. So that was the shape of it laid out. On the morning of the second day, the wood's evidence and the old man's memory fitted together. A miller who would not give up his neighbor's trust, a banker who wanted it, forged notes, a true record hidden under a floor, a fire to erase the question, and a death that everyone agreed to call an accident because the alternative was to quarrel with the bank. And now a woman with a millwright's hands had bought the ruin for $40 and lifted the first board. She went down into the chamber on the second day with Ned Forsythe holding a lantern at the lip of the opening because she had decided he was honest, and because a witness was worth more than solitude now. The chamber was low. A man could not have stood in it, and it was framed, as she had known it would be, by a hand that understood building. The joists were sound. The air was the cold-held breath of 2 years and more. And in the chamber, set on a low cribbing of timber to keep them off the earth, were the things Tobias Het had hidden. There was the iron box, the mill's old strong box with its lid down and its hasp closed. There were 3 smaller wooden boxes, dovetailed at the corners by a careful hand, the joints so tight that the damp had not gotten into them. And there was, wrapped in oiled cloth and then in waxed canvas against the wet, a ledger. The true ledger, the real accounts of the mill. In Tobias Het's own hand, every deposit and every withdrawal, every name in the valley, and what they had left and what they were owed, going back through all the lean years. Cora brought it up into the light first, before the boxes, because the ledger was the thing that mattered. Coin can be argued over. A name in a dead man's honest hand, in a book sealed under a floor before the forgeries were ever made, that is a thing that argues back. She turned the pages by the lantern, with Ned Forsythe leaning over her shoulder, and the old man began to weep without sound, because he found his own name there, and the names of men he had buried, and beside the names the sums they had trusted to Tobias and never seen again. The sums the bank had said were debts the mill owed rather than deposits the mill held. The chamber held a little over $4,000. In coin, in 2 small sacks of gold dust, and in the iron box a quantity of paper currency that had kept because the box was tight and the chamber was dry. $4,000 and some, the savings of a valley hidden by an honest man under a floor. He trusted more than he trusted any bank. It was not Cora's money. She understood that the moment she understood what it was. She had bought a building for $40 and found $4,000 in it, and the $4,000 belonged to the people whose names were in the book. A different woman, the town would say later, telling the story in years to come, a different woman would have taken the coin and gone, and no one would ever have known, because the dead do not count their gold. Cora Vane, though, had been raised by a man who taught her that the wood remembers everyone who ever touched it. She did not think she could spend money that a dead man had died protecting and live easily in the same skin afterward. And there was the other thing, colder and just as true. The money was evidence. The money proved the ledger, and the ledger proved the forgeries, and the forgeries proved Royal Tasker, and a woman who took the money and ran would be leaving the man who burned the mill to keep on holding paper over a third of the valley. She closed the chamber back up. She laid the boards back down over it, the whole ones she had lifted, and pinned them, because she did not want the valley walking through her mill to gawk at a hole, and because the chamber had kept its secret 2 years and could keep it 2 days more while she decided how to use it rightly. She took only the ledger, wrapped again in its oiled cloth, and she took it to the one place in that country where it might be made to count, which was not the deputy, and not the bank. The county seat was at Farron, 2 days off by wagon, and at Farron there was a circuit judge who came through 4 times a year and a land office that kept the records of every deed and note in the county. Cora and Ned Forsyth went together, the old man because he could swear to the names and the history, the woman because she could swear to the floor and the building and the manner of the hiding, and because the ledger was in her keeping and she would not let it out of her hands. What followed was not a confrontation. There was no scene in which Cora stood before Royal Tasker and named his crime, because that is not how such things are truly undone, and it is not how she undid it. She undid it with paper laid against paper, which is the only language a man like Tasker had ever respected, and the only one that could reach him. At the land office in Farron, the clerk brought out the notes the bank had filed against the mill, the notes that said Tobias Hett had borrowed against the property and defaulted. And Cora laid beside them the true ledger, and a thing became plain that no amount of polish could talk away. The forged notes were dated to years when, by the mill's true accounts, the mill had been holding the valley's money, not borrowing. Worse for Tasker, the forger had made the small mistake that forgers make, which is that he had matched Tobias Hett's signature too well and his figures not well enough. The notes were written in a hand that formed its sevens with a crossbar, a small modern habit, and Tobias Hett, an older man trained in an older school, had never in 30 years of the true ledger crossed a single 7. A man can forge a signature. It is very hard to forge 30 years of a habit a man does not know he has. The crossed 7s were on every forged note and on none of the true pages. The wood had told Cora where to look, and now the ink told the rest. The circuit judge, when he came through 3 weeks later, was a man named Harmon Seeley, and he was not from the valley and held no note at the Cattlemen's and Merchants' Trust, and that was the whole of why it worked. He read the ledger, he compared the hands, he heard Ned Forsyth swear to the deposits and the names, and he heard Cora Vane describe plainly and without heat the void under the floor, the newer nails in the older boards, the chamber framed by a careful hand, the held breath of the sealed air, the boxes and the book. She did not accuse, she described. She let the floor and the ink do the accusing, the way her grandfather had taught her to let the work speak. And a description, when every piece of it fits, is heavier than any accusation. Royal Tasker was not arrested in a grand moment. Men like Tasker rarely are. What happened was quieter and, in its way, more complete. The forged notes were struck from the record. The mill's title was cleared of the false debt. And once the true ledger was in the county record and the judge had taken an interest, other men in the valley who had been holding paper from the Cattlemen's and Merchants' Trust began to ask out loud in the way men will once one brave question has been asked, whether their own notes were as honest as the bank had said. A bank runs on the belief that its paper is true. When that belief cracks, the bank does not survive a gunfight, because there is no gunfight. It simply empties. As men withdraw what they can and refuse to pay what they doubt, and the polished man at the center of it finds one morning that he holds a great deal of paper that no longer frightens anyone. Within a year, Royal Tasker had left the valley. Cora never saw him again. She had never in the whole affair been in the same room with him but once. The day she paid her $40, and she found she did not need to be. The $4,000 went back to the names in the book. This was the slow part, and the part Cora cared most about, and she did it the way she did all her work, one joint at a time. She and Ned Forsyth took the ledger from family to family across the valley through that winter and the next spring, and they found the people, or where the people were dead. They found the sons and the daughters, and they returned what had been left with Tobias Het, measured against his honest figures to the dollar. There was a widow named Alma Tench, who had given up a small farm because the bank said she owed it, and who came to the door of the boarding-house room she now kept in town, with her hands already twisting in her apron, expecting bad news, because bad news was the only kind that had come to her door in 2 years. Cora set the ledger on the table and turned it to the page and read out the figure in Tobias Het's own hand, the deposit Alma's husband had left at the mill the year before he died, the deposit the bank had called a debt. Then she counted the coin into the widow's hands, slow, so the woman could see each piece and believe it. Alma Tench did not say thank you for a long moment. She stood and wept at her own door, holding the coin against her chest, and then she said only that her husband had told her, the week before he passed, that the money was safe with Tobias, and that she had spent 2 years thinking him a trusting fool. She knew now he had been right. That was worth more to her, she said, than the coin, though she did not give the coin back. There was a man, grown now, who had been a boy when his father left gold dust at the mill and died before he could draw it, and who had grown up being told his father had been a fool who lost everything, and who learned that winter that his father had been an honest man robbed by a forger, which is a different inheritance to carry. Cora kept nothing from the chamber for herself. She was offered shares of it, more than once, by grateful families who could not understand a person who would find $4,000 and keep none of it. She took only what she had always meant to earn, which was the work. With the mill's title cleared, and with the goodwill of a valley that had learned what kind of hands had come among them, she had more work than one woman could do. She did not rebuild the mill to grind grain. The stones were cracked beyond saving, and grain milling was a dying trade in a country the railroad had reached. She rebuilt it as a shop, a millwright's and joiner's shop, the trade her grandfather had carried, and she took the heavy old milling floor she had once pried up and she relaid it sound, this time with no chamber under it and nothing hidden, every board pinned tight to its joist, because she had learned the hard worth of a floor a person could trust. The men who had laughed did not, on the whole, come and apologize, because that is not how such men are made. Del Quint never said he had been wrong about her. He brought her a broken wagon to mend that spring, though, and paid her fare for it, and that was as near to an apology as a man like Del Quint comes, and Cora took it as one and said nothing, because the work had said everything that needed saying, and she had never required more. Phelps the auctioneer stopped telling his joke about the charcoal. The valley simply began, over a season, to speak of her as the millwright at Halden's Crossing, and then, only as the millwright, the trade and the place fused to her name, the way a thing becomes true by being said enough times by enough people who have reason to mean it. Ned Forsyth died 3 years on in his own bed, with his own name cleared on the county record, and the small sum he had left at the mill 30 years before back in his hand and spent, by his choosing, on a headstone for Tobias Het that told the truth about how the man had died. He had asked Cora to cut the lettering, because she had the hands for fine work, and she had done it, every letter, chiseled slow and deep so the weather would be a long time taking it. The stone said that Tobias Het had kept faith with his neighbors and had died for it, and that the faith had been kept in return, late, but kept. Cora Vane lived a long time at Holden's Crossing. She never went back to Elias Birch, and he never came for her, because by the time he might have, she was a woman, the valley would have closed around like a fist, and men like Elias Birch can read that much weather. She trained 2 apprentices in the long course of her years, a girl and a boy both, because she had decided that what her grandfather poured into her was not to stop in her, and she taught them the framing and the joints and the housing of gears, and she taught them the slow way with the pry and the mallet. And she taught them the thing Asa Vane had taught her, that the wood remembers everyone who ever touched it, and that if you go slow enough, it will tell you what they did. The tool chest sat in the corner of her shop to the end, oak banded in iron, the lid worn pale where 100 years of hands had lifted it. On the morning she did not get up, the apprentices found the shop swept and the tools hung in their places, and the chest closed, the way she had kept it every day of her working life, because a person who has once found what a floor can hide does not leave her own house in disorder. And the floor of that shop, the heavy milling floor she had pried up board by board and laid back down sound, never gave back anything but the dull, dead, honest sound of a thing with nothing underneath it to hide. She had walked across it 10,000 times, and it had told her every time the truth, which after the life she had lived was the only thing she had ever asked of a floor, or of anyone. If you have ever been the one everyone agreed was a fool for what you believed in, sit with that a moment, and think on what patience can lift that force never could. And if a story of a thing buried and brought back to light is the kind you would hear again, there are others like it waiting, each one a different ruin and a different pair of hands.